Good evening. I'm E. Carmen Ramos, Curator for Latino Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecture Series. This evening is the first of 3 lectures in the 2013 season. We hope that you will also consider returning on October 30th for our second installment featuring Time magazine critic Richard Lacayo. More details about the series can be found in our calendar of events available in our lobby. And as always, we thank Clarice Smith for making the series possible. Before I say a few words about our speaker, I ask that you please silence your mobile devices, as tonight's event is being recorded and simultaneously webcast for our remote viewers. There will be a Q&A period after the lecture. We ask that you present your questions at one of the microphones on either end of the auditorium so that our viewing audience can hear your questions. A reception will follow tonight's lecture in the G Street lobby on the first floor. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Teresita Fernandez. Born in Miami, Florida, and now based in Brooklyn, New York, Fernandez is a conceptual artist known for her large-scale works and use of unconventional materials, which she often marshals into powerful views of the landscape and other natural phenomena. Over the course of her career, she's created immersive and what she calls sensorial works and sculptures and installations that often function as objects in and of themselves and experiences waiting to happen. Previous works, composed of such wide-ranging materials such as fabric, thread, glass beads, and acrylic tiles, have evoked classical gardens, the atmospheric effects of a volcanic eruption, or a body of water under intense sunlight. Our museum recently acquired Nocturnal Horizon Line from 2010, a major work from a series made entirely of mined graphite. This work is currently on view in our Lincoln Gallery on the 3rd floor and will also be featured in our upcoming exhibition, Our America, the Latino Presence in American Art, which opens next month on October 25th. Our America will present selections from the museum's pioneering collection of Latino art and will consider how Latino artists participated in American art movements and recalibrated key themes in American art and culture. Fortunate for us, Fernandez's ties to the Capitol seem to be strengthening. She just completed a large-scale commission titled Constellation for the newly inaugurated headquarters of the United States Coast Guard here in Washington, D.C. Fernandez has garnered many awards, including a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Lewis Comfort Tiffany Biennial Award. In 2011, President Obama appointed her to serve on the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, a federal panel that advises the President, Congress, and government agencies on national matters of design and aesthetics. We are delighted that she's with us tonight. I now welcome Teresita to the stage.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming. I wanted to just briefly thank Carmen Ramos and Nona Martin for organizing tonight's lecture and for inviting me to be this year's speaker. Before I start with images, I just wanted to very briefly preface what I'll show you with a little bit of a sense of how I work. My working process is really very conceptual, so I usually spend a lot of time reading and writing and doing a lot of research, and there are a lot of sort of historical and cultural references that become important to my thinking process. And it's only until I've sort of figured all of that out that I start to work with materials, and that's sort of the second phase of how something comes together formally or technically. So that first part of the process is very hard to describe because it's a very subjective thing. In giving a lecture, it's a good opportunity to talk about those things because one is looking at them in hindsight. So after something's done, it's easy for me to sort of walk you through it. When I'm in that process, though, it is really a very blind process, and it's really like sort of falling down a rabbit hole, and it is a little bit of an exercise in tangents, and it's sort of accumulating things that resonate with me for some reason, but which I may not really know why yet. So there's a little bit of that sense of sensing something and knowing that it's important and that it has meaning, but not yet understanding the shape that it has or its reason for being. And I'll talk a little bit more about this idea of blindness, and which has been a theme that's been important to me throughout my work. I've always been really interested in the kind of etymological thread between the words spectrum, spectator, and specter. So that if you think of the word that refers to ghost, and the word that we use to talk about color ranges, and the word that we use to talk about the viewer, the spectator, they all come from the same place. And it's a little bit like that with works of art. I think that the best works of art are the ones that haunt us a little and that linger and that stay with us even when they're no longer in front of our eyes. So those are all things that I'm interested in. All of that oftentimes gets very sort of sloppily lumped into ideas of perception. But for me, that word kind of doesn't mean very much, because I think it's much more complex and layered than that, and it's much more subtle and more personal and more emotional. So I really like to think of the viewer not as this sort of nameless face. You know, we always use this word when we talk about art, or when we learn about art in school, about who the viewer is. And it never made sense to me. It's a word that I've always been bothered by, as though the viewer were some sort of mechanical person that moves through the space, or you hear these descriptions like, well, your eye goes here, then your eye goes there. It's like, well, whose eye? You know, with this idea that the viewer is like this floating eyeball. And the viewer isn't that. The viewer is really, it's an individual. And so there's many ways of looking as there are people. So I like to think of my viewer, and I like to think of myself as a viewer when I see things, much more as a reader. I've always thought that the word reader is a much more accurate description of what happens when we look at things. And so if you think about reading, you can read in a very sort of superficial way, the way you read, say, a blurb in a magazine, or you can read, really investing yourself in what it is that you're reading and identifying with the scenes taking place and the plot and the characters, and feeling in the kind of emotional affinity for the things that you're reading about. And that's a totally different kind of reading. It's active, it's dynamic, it's not passive. So the kind of looking that I'm interested in for myself in the world, but also the kind of artworks that I'm interested in making, are works that function almost like a kind of catalyst to put you in that position of constructing images, which is in a sense exactly what we do when we read. You know, when we read, it's not what's giving form to those things is not really the words on the page, but rather the images that you're constructing in your mind's eye. And that's something that's really important for me. So while it's very hard to talk about, so my work is experiential basically, and there aren't any instructions attached to it. It's about sort of being there, and many times it's sort of immersive, so it's an extension of your own body and space. So those are things that are very hard to describe in photographic images, impossible to describe. So I'm not going to attempt in this lecture to talk to you about how you may or may not feel if you were in one of these pieces, but I do hope you'll have an opportunity to experience one of the works in person, because it's an entirely different experience. What lectures are good for, though, is to show references and how ideas come to be, and how points of connection start to create meaning. And also, it's a good way to show you a little bit of the technical process of how things get made and how I make things in my studio, which is sort of the second half of my process after I've figured out why I want to make something. So I'm going to start with, and I've actually reduced the lecture tonight to really just a handful of works from about the last 10 years or so. You're looking at maybe, I don't know, a quarter of the work I've done, but I prefer to sort of focus a little bit more in depth on the selection of works that are important for me rather than trying to show you everything I've done. There's certainly lots of information online if you're curious to see other manifestations of how the work, what happens with the work in other contexts. So I'll jump right in, and I'm going to go kind of fast, and I'm hoping to speak about 40 minutes or so, and then I'm hoping that some of you may have questions. I welcome questions from you. So this is a piece, this is an early work. The first two that I'll show you are rather older pieces. They're from 1996. And just, I wanted to show them as a kind of starting point, and then I'll jump to works that are more recent in the last sort of couple of years, 7, 8 years. This is it's an untitled piece, and it looks like a big empty swimming pool. The walls are spray painted with a kind of blue paint that shifts and subtly gradates as it goes up the wall. And there's some subtle things happening that if you were in this space you'd see, but that you can't see in this image. There are drawings on the wall that look like repeated squares that are almost like little tiles. So this piece, when I was working on this piece, I was thinking about this design for a house for Josephine Baker, which was designed by the modernist architect Adolphe Loos in the 1920s. It was never built, but it exists in models and in plans. And it's a fascinating design. I've always been interested in it. Oftentimes when you think of a domestic space, a home, this is a home for somebody, you think of yourself sort of looking out. So you're in the privacy of your home and you have windows and you look out into the world, and there's a sense of what happens inside is private and what happens outside is public. And in the design that Adolphe Loos had for Josephine Baker, let me go back for just one moment. There's a shifting of this, that the eye is really directed inward, and the whole space was designed around an indoor swimming pool. So there's an indoor swimming pool in the middle of the space. Above it, there are skylights. If you're walking on the first floor of the house, you're walking around some darkened hallways with some windows that are cut into the pool so that you could see into the pool, almost like an aquarium. And really, I mean, what was interesting about this for me is that the idea of Josephine Baker as the person who was going to live in this house, the whole design really revolved around exoticizing the idea of looking at her. The idea of both someone who is on display or makes a living at it and identifies with being on display, but someone also who's being watched, who's being looked at, who's being objectified, who's being exoticized. And all of these things were interesting for me. At the time I was interested in a lot of feminist film theory and architecture theory, and this connects to a lot of that period in my life. The way you enter the piece, and I'll describe it just so that you can understand what's happening, is you enter the piece through this darkened hallway where there are some windows cut into a space. On the other side of that wall, when you get to the end of this hallway, you go up some stairs, and you are on the high end of this ramped floor that dips down into this space. So back to the Josephine Baker home. If Josephine Baker was swimming in that pool with those skylights above her, those windows that she could swim in front of would work like mirrors. She would see her own reflection because there were skylights above. If you were the person walking through those darkened hallways, you would not be seen, but you could look inside. It's very simple, it's very low-tech. It's basically the same idea as tinted windows on a car. There's sunlight on the outside, you have reflection, you see yourself. If you're on the inside, you're on the dark side. You're in the darkened inside, and so you see through the glass. So the way this piece functioned is that if you were on the side, you could look inside. It was dark, and you could look in through these windows and see people in there. But if you were on this side, you would only see your own reflection. And it basically works exactly like tinted windows. And what was fascinating was to see people's behavior. So having already gone through the hallway in order to get in here, you were completely aware that each of these windows could represent somebody watching you, right? There could be someone on the other side of these windows at any point because you were just there. And the notion that you could occupy both a narcissistic gaze and a voyeuristic gaze in the same person. These are things that are usually separated, like you have the subject, the object, you have the one person looking at the other person. But to sort of embody both being the person looking and then the person being watched was a really interesting set of conditions for me. Shortly after, I made this other empty pool piece, and all I did was basically raise the floor of the gallery about 6 feet or so. The dark space that you see in the middle, the gray part, is the real floor of the gallery space. And there's a lot happening that looks like it's happening with lights, like this sort of hazy coloring, but it's all done with spray paint on the walls. So it's this very sort of atmospheric space. And again, I was sort of still thinking about that idea of looking and being looked at. In this case, no matter where you stood in this setup, every gaze was exactly equal to every other gaze. So it was a little bit like being on a stage with this big sort of dumb hole in the middle of the space that didn't go anywhere. This is a work that I did after that. It's called Borrowed Landscape. And I was thinking about the idea of an indoor landscape or an outdoor room, and what would happen if I merged the decorative interior with the decorative landscape. So it consists of 5 volumes that are made out of walls of fabric. The tops are made out of wood. There's a hole inside each of those ceiling pieces, and the floors are covered with a very intricate drawing, which I'll show you in a minute. The lights, everything is the same color. The light is a fixture that has bulbs that simulate daylight. So everything that you see that's colored in these volumes is the actual material. The fabric is that color, the ceiling's that color, the floor drawing is that color. And you could walk around these depending on how you walk around them almost like a kind of labyrinth. So depending on where you were standing, these planes, the sides of the walls, would shift from being translucent to being opaque and not see-through. On the floor, there's a drawing that's based on 17th century formal gardens. At the time, I was doing a lot of research in 17th century formal gardens, like Vaux-le-Vicomte and Versailles, just for sort of recognition. It's the one that people usually relate to the most because they know it. But the thing that interested me about 17th century formal gardens, European formal gardens, is that they're always represented like this. They're always represented like this bird's eye view of a place. And of course, if you go to Versailles and you're standing at the back of the chateau looking out on this landscape that's represented here, you would never see this. You know, you would just see this sort of the high points of this vast landscape compressed into this pictorial space where you just see something that's flattened out. You would never see all of these geometric patterns in the way that you'd see them here. And what was important about that for me was the fact that in order to, these are the floors, the drawings on the floors are all based on these shaped parterre hedge patterns, and they're very tiny. But what was important for me about that is that the only way that you could understand the geometry of those shaped hedges was by walking around them. And so this notion of an ambulatory viewer, a viewer that's on the move, a viewer that understands something by moving through it, is something that's consistent in almost every work that I'll show you. It depends on someone actually moving through the space in order to complete the circuit of meaning. So you would walk around these, and there may be one of these planes that's see-through, and you see somebody standing on the other side, and then you could turn a corner and you wouldn't see anything. And so there was a sense of sort of getting lost and meandering through a given space. The title of the piece, Borrowed Landscape, comes from a traditional Japanese gardening technique called shakei. And I spent a lot of time in Japan. I first went there in 1998, and I lived there for a while. And I've been back almost every year since. It's a place that figures prominently in my thinking and my development as an artist. But Borrowed Landscape, the title of the piece that I just showed you, is the sort of English translation for shakei, which is a gardening technique in traditional Japanese gardens. And it's also a bad translation of what shakkei is. If you translated shakkei correctly, it would mean to capture alive. And it functions a little bit like this. It's in the Japanese interior. Japanese interior tends to be very dark. There's not much of a connection between there's not much of a separation between the inside and the outside. And so what happens is that with this, basically this wall missing, you could, in that space, compose a scene. And it's very deliberate. There may be a cropped bush in the foreground, Mount Fuji in the background, and then in the middle ground, a tree or a hedge or a rock. And it's hard to describe how it actually feels when you're inside of a traditional Japanese setting looking out at the landscape, but it's a little bit like it's a projection or a diorama. It reads that way because it's a glowing kind of effect. And I remember the first time I went to Kyoto and went to one particular temple in Nanzenji, called Nanzenji, I walked into one of the small rooms, and this entire scene was reflected on the top of a lacquer table, and I was just I was so impressed by this sort of hovering projection and this sort of artificiality, because it read almost like a kind of projection, this sort of glow, made with something that was completely just what was outside. It had less to do with the landscape and more to do with just how it is that our eyes work and how space and distance is compressed, and how we sort of react to these distal cues in order to read scenes. That's borrowed landscapes, some other images. This is a piece called Bamboo Cinema, which I did in Madison Square Park in New York City through the Public Art Fund. And Bamboo Cinema is made, it's a kind of labyrinth of concentric circles, sort of like a circular maze, made out of these translucent polycarbonate tubes that I had made. So the color is very specific. Actually, the color on them is very specifically made. It's not just generic green tubes. But you can't see that, so I won't go into it. The piece is based on the idea of an early cinematic device, like a zoetrope. And in order to understand this piece, and the one that I'll talk about right after this, I wanted to just stop for 1 second and explain a little bit the concept of persistence of vision. Because it's something that we kind of think we know, but we don't, oftentimes people don't understand what I'm talking about, and it's easier to just sort of break it down, and it's a very sort of interesting phenomenon that, again, has less to do with technology or apparatus and much more to do with just how our eyes work. Everything that I'll show you today is very optical, but very low-tech. It has to do with just how you respond to something visually. So persistence of vision, I use this image by Muybridge of a bird in flight just to illustrate it. When you see a movie, when you go to the movie theater, and you see a movie being projected, if we slowed that down and you looked at a film strip, we know that there are frames, right? We know that they're individual images. We usually think that what makes them look like they're moving is the fact that they're in a projector. But all a projector does is it just projects them. Between every image, the shutter closes. So there is a moment between one film still and the next film still, or one frame and the second frame, where the shutter closes. That's the sound of the projector. It's like same thing that happens with your camera. While that shutter is closed, so you get one image. First image is projected, shutter closes. While that shutter is closed, there is no image being projected. What happens is that the first image is retained on the back of your retina as a ghost image. When the second frame is then projected, it appears to connect to the first one. And if you speed this up and you just do it over and over and over and over again, it looks like something's moving. So this piece, Bamboo Cinema, is pretty much based on that same basic idea. If you were to run around this piece, everything that you would see through it would appear to be sort of pixelated. If you were standing still and a yellow cab went down Fifth Avenue, it would kind of go in and out of the piece. It would just sort of distort and turn green. In this context, this is the piece sort of in situ. In this context, the verticals, each tube functions very much like that shutter. You're looking at something, you're looking at a scene through this, and each of those poles sort of cuts off your vision for a minute. And just keep that in mind, as later on I'll talk about other things that have to do with blindness and not seeing, and how seeing is amplified sometimes by what you don't see. I like to think sometimes of the viewer as being a performer slash spectator, so that in a way it's like you set this thing into motion, all of these pieces. There's a kind of dynamic effect that happens because someone is present, witnessing, and moving. When this piece, I'm just remembering now that when this piece went up, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon had just been released, and we had many, many people coming through the park trying to do stunts on these poles, which were not made out of flexible bamboo. But it was very interesting to see how the public interacted with something in a public space. It's something that really fascinates me. I don't do a lot of public artworks because I think they're hard to do well, but when you put something in a public space, the people who really understand it the best are the users of the space, and they always use it in a way that you hadn't anticipated as an artist. So it's a very interesting set of things that happens. This piece is called Fire, and in many ways it's a lot like bamboo cinema. It functions exactly the same way. I was for some time I really wanted to, I played with this image for a long time and couldn't figure out how to do it in a way that wasn't a cliche. It's like there's certain things as an artist that you can't really touch, rainbows, can't make rainbows. Fire, it's, I can't do it. But I really wanted to, I was really just obsessed with this idea of making something, not with the image of fire, but making something that would behave like fire. And I can't tell you I can't describe to you how that happens. If you were in front of this, you would know that this whole ring appears to be sort of like a moire pattern that's dancing around. You'll have to take my word for it in this case. This is in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. If you're ever there, it's in their permanent collection and you can experience it firsthand. But it's all made out of silk, and there are two steel rings, and there are silk threads on either side of that silk ring, so the outside and the inside, and the whole thing hovers above the ground a few inches. Silk is a very strong material, so it's really the silk that's holding up the weight of this whole thing. If you took the idea that I just explained of bamboo cinema and you just sort of refined it to these tiny little silk threads, very, very fine, it's essentially what happens here. Each one of those little silk threads is a tiny little shutter that closes each time, so you're seeing through it and then not seeing through it on a sort of micro level. And with this piece, I like to, because I have I did this with the Fabric Workshop and Museum in Philadelphia, and I had an amazing project manager, and worked with some really talented people who really know fabric well. And I wanted to talk a little bit, just because I have such great reference process images here, about how this piece was made. After I've figured out how to make something, why I want to make something, I have to figure out how to make it. And a lot of times my big challenge is that I want to make things that look like they're ephemeral and they're floating. And that's easy if you make film or photography or if you write, or if you paint. But if you make sculpture, materials really just want to be themselves. A piece of wood wants to be a piece of wood. A rock is heavy, it wants to sit on the ground. And so always in all of these pieces, there's this sense of like, well, the tone of it, what I want it to do is just like appear that it's floating. Like if I could take a Rothko painting and make a three-dimensional version of it and you could walk around it. But it's really hard to do that. So the early models for fire were these really clumsy pieces of curved plastic that just looked horrendous. And I couldn't figure out how to get rid of the sort of structure that would hold something up. And at that time, my project manager at the time, Marianne Friel, we went to this place called Scala Madre, which is an old textile place that used to be in Long Island City in Queens. It's a sort of historical, like a lot of the historical textiles that are used in upholstery or drapery in the White House would have been made by Scala Madre, for example. And we walked into their factory, and it was basically just rooms and rooms of these mechanical looms weaving thread. And at that moment, I realized, it struck me that the piece needed to be like a big mechanical loom. This is silk being dyed there commercially. And so the piece really became a way of interpreting that mechanical loom into a sculpture and just taking that same principle and expanding upon it. So we got lots of thread, lots of very particular thread. We became experts on the million kinds of silk that there are that all reflect light differently depending on how they've been woven and how they've been twisted. And we worked with a weaver who finished the top edge and the bottom edge of those panels that you see. The edge that's woven is hidden underneath this little metal panel at the top, so you don't see it. So all you see are the individual threads. And then it was a really sort of taxing exercise in figuring out how to get the illusion to happen. So it was about testing these panels at certain distances. At any given point in the piece, you're looking through 4 panels of silk. If I put the panels too close together, all I would see was solid red. If I put them too far apart, all I would see is whatever was behind them. But if I put them at the right distance from one another, which is what I was trying to figure out in this, I could get that moire pattern, and I can get that sort of shifting where your eye couldn't really focus on any one thread, and it always appears to be moving. So the way it was made is there were 10 colors used, and they were custom mixed for this piece. And on the left of this image, you'll see a tiny little drawing, which is basically that ring opened up with my little sketch. That sketch was turned into life-size templates, real scale templates of that pattern. And those templates were put against the silk thread, and they were sprayed over and over and over again with those 10 colors, which is a process that you kind of have to guess at, because when silk is dyed, you have to apply about 40% more color than what actually stays on it. So by the end of it, it sort of looked like a 1970s horror film or Carrie's prom scene or something. And then those panels were washed many times, and then they were each steamed for 6 hours. So it's this very sort of, and we didn't know how to do it, they didn't know how to do it. So each piece really is a kind of trying to invent how you can make something. Very rarely does it just exist, like, oh, this is the way you do it. Because it's art and it's not, they're not standard sizes, they're not standard colors, it all has to be specific. It really is kind of like inventing a process in order for it to come out the way you imagine it. This is a piece from 2007. It's called Ink Mirror, and it's made out of high polished fiberglass and marble dust on the bottom. And I was thinking at the time, I had been reading a lot about this little 19th century device that's called the Claude glass. And it's a small piece of glass about the size of a postcard that was very popular in the early 19th century. And it was made out of black glass or obsidian, very shiny. And it's a kind of visual tool that was used by landscape painters who wanted to paint like Claude Lorraine. So what they would do is they would go out in the landscape, plein air, and they would choose the image that the scene that they wanted to paint, and they would turn their back to it to the scene, and they would hold up this little clawed glass, and they would look at that image reflected in this little piece of curved black glass. And what it does is, it's not a true reflection, but it reflects the sort of brightest highlights and the deepest shadows. It's a little bit like what would happen if you took a Photoshop function now and just did some like high contrast, took an image and did high contrast, and everything just became extreme. The interesting thing for me about this particular little object is that it was also used by pilgrims who would go on pilgrimages and kind of, say, walk for 3 weeks to go see a particular abbey in rural England, and they would bring it along, and then when they would get there, they would turn their back to it and look at it, almost like trying to capture it inside the reflection of this, which is a kind of absurd notion, but it speaks to the power of images and this sort of desire that we have to contain images and to almost own them somehow. So Ink Mirror is based on that. There's a very short video here where you can kind of see what happens, but it becomes like a real-time film being projected of everything around it, and it's sort of about being in front of it. This is a piece called Longing Double Portrait. It's made out of black onyx and glass with silvering behind it. This is the black onyx. This is these are convex, polished, handmade little mirrors. So each one of these little mirrors reflects everything in the space, including you in the space, upside down and reversed. And I was really thinking about this idea of distortion, of seeing yourself seeing, but being outside of yourself, this sort of disembodiment. And this piece is really, exactly what it's called. It's a double portrait. And in a lot of my work, there is this interest in portraiture, but it's not obvious. It's very indirect. It's always not a literal kind of portraiture. If you look at this painting, it's by a Flemish painter, Quentin Matsy, it's called The Money Changer and His Wife from 1514, you'll see that in the bottom there's this little mirror, and it basically shows you what's not in the scene. So the convex mirrors are a little bit like that. They're a distortion of what you think you're seeing. You're seeing something, but what you're not seeing is also informing your sense of that reality, of that moment. This is a piece called Seattle Cloud Cover. It is an outdoor work that's permanently sited in Seattle in the Olympic Sculpture Park. If you're ever in Seattle, it lives there. And it is about a block long, about the length of a city block. And when I was presented with this commission, none of this existed. It was just brownfields. But I really became enamored of the site, which was a pedestrian bridge that was to be built over working trains. So the trains coming in and out of Seattle are using these particular train tracks. And I was just fascinated by the idea of making an artwork where I could have one motion superimposed on another motion, one movement superimposed on another movement. So the movement of you walking on this walkway superimposed on the movement of the rumbling vibration of the trains underneath you. A little bit, and I imagined all this because nothing existed, none of this was built, including the overpass. But a little bit like when you walk on a moving escalator, where one thing on top of the other is sort of very disorienting. And the piece is made out of glass with a photographic inner layer that I made with many thousands of images of clouds that I took in Miami. I wanted to do it with clouds in Seattle, but there were never any good clouds. It was always just gray, much to their dismay. But there are great, all kinds of colorful clouds in Miami, so that's where these images come from. And it's a big montage. It's really just like thousands of images that have been put together. But there is a pattern in it of clear openings, little holes that are opening, and again back to that idea of persistence of vision. Basically, when you're walking through here, when you look to the right, you see Puget Sound, beautiful, mountain background. When you look to the left, what you see is downtown Seattle. You see the Space Needle, and as you're walking, because it's a pedestrian walkway, you're walking, Downtown Seattle appears in and out of those little holes. Same thing, the colored areas are nothing more than that shutter again closing before your eyes. And this is a kind of fun piece for me to talk about my references, because there were many. And when I was making this piece, I thought about so many things at once. It's really like meandering through ideas and making connections between things, and it's never logical or linear. But it's a little bit like poetry, where each word is exquisitely precise and specific, but the finished product is elusive and layered and hard to name or pinpoint. So when I made this piece, I was thinking about Jericho's Wrath of the Medusa and 19th century romantic painting. I was thinking of Hokusai's woodcuts. This is two men washing a horse in a waterfall from 1838. I was thinking of the saturated backgrounds in Japanese anime. I was thinking of the surreal and slightly comical tacky clouds in the backgrounds of Maxfield Parrish paintings. And just to give a disclaimer, Parrish is not a big influence on me, but if you grow up with a book or a poster or seeing something, it kind of tends to sort of stay lodged in your mind, in your memory, and you somehow have an emotional connection to it. So they're sort of silly clouds, but they're sort of good too. They're good clouds as well. I was thinking of Rothko and of saturated color fields that always appear to be suspended in midair. And the piece changes, so it's really like if you went at a particular time of day, you might see this very sort of saturated image, really intense colors. At sunset, for example, it's a very intensely colored piece. If you went in the middle of the day, it's totally just clear, or like a watercolory quality to it. It changes season by season. Sometimes it's very bright. Sometimes it's a very somber piece. And there are all kinds of things that happen where the color starts to, depending on that movement of the sun, it starts to sort of affect everything around it. I'll just go through these quickly. This is, This is the Blanton Museum of Art in Austin, Texas. This is what it was like before I got there. It was a very alienating space, lobby space. This is the way into the museum. So you have to go up these stairs to go into the museum, which is on that second level. The only sort of interesting part of the space were they had a lot of natural light, had these really nice skylights. And I made this piece called Stacked Waters a few years ago. It's still there, it's permanently installed. And it basically consists of custom cast acrylic that's been cast to particular colors, and it starts at blue and slowly goes up to white. I was faced with this really sort of difficult space that had this arcade on one side and this big sort of staircase on the other, and it was very hard to figure out what to do with it. So I decided that I would just treat it as a kind of container and fill it with water. So these horizontal lines, which become like water lines, and as you move through the space and you go up those stairs, that water line starts shifting in relation to your body. It doesn't really, you shift in relation to it, or it changes in relation to you. But when you get to the top of those stairs, it's sort of like stepping out of a pool. I'll show you another. The title is sort of an inside joke to myself, and it refers to, of course, Judd's iconic stack pieces. Judd having a legendary presence in this part of Texas. But in many ways, after I built the piece, I realized that it was like being on the inside of a Judd stack piece. Because of those skylights, and once again, this relates back to Josephine Baker, that surface could be totally matte and not where you'd see nothing, or at a particular time of the day, it would be very, very bright. I was thinking of ancient Roman cisterns. The word cistern comes from cista, box, and it comes from the Greek word for basket, which is a waterproof receptacle for holding liquids. So it was an interesting sort of point of connection for me, the idea of inverting this sort of very unattractive arcade into something that made sense with the idea of filling it with water. And this is like when you get to the very top, that white line is literally sort of at about your ankles, depending on how tall you are. And the pieces, this is a Judd piece again, but my piece is like a barometer of the changing sort of atmospheric Texas light. It becomes almost like a mirror to what's around it. So like Judd's marvelous works in Marfa, the surroundings are really sort of absorbed and reflected in the work. And when you see this space full of people, it starts to be activated. It's sort of like ink mirror, where those surfaces become alive and dynamic, and they're not just color on a wall. This is a view going into Naoshima, which is a small island in the Seto Inland Sea around Japan. And the approach to Naoshima is really sort of otherworldly. It's a very sort of ghostly landscape. If you're familiar with Hiroshi Sugimoto's original images of the Seto Inland Sea, this is where they were taken. It's a very beautiful place that's very special to me. Naoshima Island is basically an undeveloped island. There's not a whole lot there, except for this museum, which is designed by Tadao Ando. And it's called the Chichu Museum. Chichu literally means below the earth. So this is a sort of aerial view that you can see, but if you're on this landscape, you really don't see any of this because it's all sort of underground. And this is an example of one of Ando's buildings in Naoshima. This is the hotel part, actually, but if you're staying in one of these rooms, you're underground. The ceiling, the roof is essentially the ground. And I was commissioned to do a piece in this setting. So this is my piece. It's called Blind Blue Landscape, and it's about 40 feet long. It's a very long piece on a ramped, curved wall of one of Ando's buildings. It's all made out of little glass cubes with silvering on the back, so they're like little mirrors. And in front of that, if you were, so this is. Oops, sorry. This is the piece. Right in front of the piece, also curved, is a window that looks out onto this landscape of the Seto Inland Sea with all these floating little islands. So this is the view outside. If you were looking at my piece and you turned around, this is what you would see. And that first image I showed was just a piece lit by moonlight. This is what it could look like at another time of the day or another season. And again, this is what's right outside. So what happens, there's a Kusama piece on the right, what happens is that each little cube becomes almost like a miniature portrait of the landscape outside. And there are tens of thousands of these cubes on the wall. They're about half an inch in width, so they're very tiny, but there are a lot of them. And you start to sort of appear in and out of these scenes. The landscape itself is sort of reflected in them. You can kind of see a little bit there. And like most of my pieces that are in these sorts of settings, they change radically depending what time of the day you're looking at them. This is a night shot. And you can kind of get a sense of the ramped floor. It was very difficult to photograph this piece, unfortunately. And I'm going to transition into this, which is just a little street in Naoshima where there's sort of nothing other than the museum except for this little fishing town. And it's an example of how my ideas come together. So I'm putting up this piece and I'm walking around this little fishing village in this tiny, tiny, tiny little town. And I'm really drawn to these surfaces, this dark wooden surface on the right. This is a very typical Japanese thing in this region in Japan, in Okayama and that area. And it's this sort of tradition of charred cedar in order to preserve the wood. It's called shosugiban. And what they do is that they burn, and they've been doing it forever, and they still do it. Now it's done in factories, but if you look at the old buildings, it's been done for just a very long time. And what they do is they burn the wood so that, as a way of preserving it from insects, as a way of preserving it from the elements, and as a way of preventing it from catching fire, which is a funny thing that you would burn something so it was less flammable. But it's also, at some point I realized, it was also like, it struck me at some point that I felt like I was walking around a drawing, because it's just charcoal. Like the side of every building was essentially the same thing that you would use to make a charcoal drawing, literally. Like if you wiped your hand on it, you'd just get it on yourself. And I loved this idea so much. It was such a poetic idea that you could walk around a little village that was a drawing, that was a three-dimensional drawing. And I made many works that came out of this series. This is a piece of the shosugiban on a very old building in Naoshima. And the ones that aren't in the factories, that are the really old ones like this, they're so shiny that they actually look blue because it's reflecting the blue of the sky. So I started thinking after that trip about the idea of landscape drawing, specifically drawing, because I felt like I was walking around a drawing. And I was thinking about old master drawings, not paintings. Most of what we learn in art history comes from the history of painting, and I always think that there's a sort of like there's everything comes from what we learn of painting, and not from necessarily from sculpture or anything else when you think of art education. But specifically, how is the landscape represented in drawing? It was this sort of funny question that I asked myself. So I was looking a lot of Leonardo da Vinci's drawings, and this one is Leonardo da Vinci's earliest known work. It's a drawing of the Arno Valley from 1473, and it's believed to be, what's important about it is that it's believed to be made from memory. So not a drawing that's being drawn for the background to show where some prince lived, but just landscape for landscape's sake. And there's something for me very different about landscape, about drawing and painting. Drawing really is kind of like an extension of thinking. It's that connection between the mind and the hand, and it's very instantaneous. So I started to think, well, what do we draw with? We draw with pencils. What are pencils? Pencils are graphite. Where does graphite come from? What's the history of graphite? And again, it's one of those rabbit holes that I just fell down and started to discover all of these other things. So graphite is discovered in Borrowdale in Cumbria in the Lake region in England. It's a totally rural area. Graphite's first discovered here in the early 1500s, and it was an enormous deposit of graphite in this particular place. The locals always found it to be very useful for marking sheep, and there's still a lot of sheep in this area. But I thought that was such a beautiful idea, that it's almost like early animation. Like if you marked your sheep and they walked around, it would be like an animation in the landscape. But I was really fascinated by this idea that you could walk in this landscape and that everything underneath your feet would be solid graphite. So again, you're walking on a drawing in this case. All of Borrowdale, like one solid drawing underneath your feet. And there's never anywhere, graphite's mined all over the world, but there's never been a deposit quite of that solidity and quality found ever again. This is an entrance to one of the mines in Borrowdale. And so I spent a year finding graphite and different kinds of graphite from all over the world. The graphite that I use in the piece that's here at the museum and in all the works that I'll show you comes from one particular mine in Sri Lanka. And it's, I could get graphite in New Jersey, but it didn't quite look as good, didn't have that luster. So the one that I use has a very high luster to it, and it's very soft, and I can work with it. And I started to draw with it, but they were really sculptures that I was making. So these are all built surfaces that are polished and relief. And from far away, these graphite drawings look like just flat, abstract black paintings. You don't see anything. As you get closer, they become sort of the opposite of that. They really become this very sort of romantic image, like that Jericho that I showed you a little while ago. And it's almost like something hiding in plain sight, which is something that I'm interested in, or like being in a dark room and watching an image develop before your eyes. And what makes it appear is not the piece itself, right? The piece doesn't move. It has to do with, again, that ambulatory viewer. So you walk in front of it, and as you walk in front of it, those different surfaces start to pick up the light in different ways, and it starts to have definition because you're moving around. So in a way, it's like you're constructing that image. You're allowing it to sort of appear before your eyes. This is a sculpture that I made called Drawn Waters, Borrowdale, and I wanted to make a drawing that was a sculpture, or a sculpture that was a drawing. So for me to assemble this sculpture was really to make a drawing. And it is, I was thinking of Leonardo's studies of moving water. And it's made with both precision and raw graphite. So what you see at the bottom here is what graphite looks like when it comes out of the ground. It's just raw. And even though we have so many references to landscape painting, we have very few references to landscape sculpture other than land art, which isn't really sculpture, it's sort of the land itself. This is a point that's always been, I think all of the work I've ever made is based on that question of why it is that we don't really have landscape sculpture as a separate genre. But one of the artists who's very influential for me is Smithson, and I thought a lot about this particular piece from 1969 called Asphalt Rundown, which he did in Rome. And it was his first flow piece. He did it in an abandoned part of a gravel quarry in Rome. He basically took a large dump truck and released a load of asphalt down a cliff that was already marked by time, everything in Rome being sort of something on top of another ruin, and made this sort of drawing in the land. In many ways, I think that the graphite pieces that I did also had that sense of marking time, because by using the graphite, which was a mined material, I was literally taking a piece of history, extracting it, almost like a kind of archaeological dig, and using it to then make an image about a landscape again. So this sort of thing coming full circle on itself. This is a picture of Passaic Falls in Passaic, New Jersey, where Smithson lived for a while, and where he explores so many of that idea of urban ruins. And many of you may know his Monuments of Passaic, which is a project that he did here. And this is a piece that I did out of graphite called Nocturnal Passaic Pour, which is really a reference to Smithson and his hometown. This is just a kind of cool picture of the Passaic Falls frozen, which is like okay. Okay. Shall I talk about one more piece? Shall I wrap it up? You want to do night writing? Okay. So this is a series called Night Writing. I was interested in the night sky as a legible surface, the stars being our first calendar, our first clock, the place where we as humans have always looked up for orientation since the beginning of time. It's all made out of handmade pulp paper. I made this in Singapore with the Singapore Tyler Print Institute. It's a studio shot. It's a very sort of physical process, lots of paint applied. That surface is, once it's made with pulp paper, with the pulp, it's dried, and then this pattern of very particular pattern of holes is blown out with pressurized air, which you can see here, and behind it a mirror is placed. That's just so that you could understand what's happening in this image that's full of these tiny little holes with a mirror behind it. So in the early 19th century, Napoleon ordered someone to come up with a code for his soldiers so that they could communicate at night without light and without making noise. Without making any sound. And a captain in the French army named Charles Barbier invented a code of communication called Decreto Nocturne, or night writing. And it was basically a piece of cardboard with holes in it that corresponded to the French phonetic sounds in the French language. And it was, of course, entirely inefficient, and it didn't work. Because if you were in the trenches and needed a piece of cardboard with a ton of holes in it, it just didn't work. But a few years later, in 1821, I believe, He visited the Institute for the Blind in Paris, which, by the way, is the first sort of Institute for the Blind anywhere. And he presented his sort of idea, just because he had to do something with it. It didn't work anywhere else. And there was a teenager in the audience named Louis Braille, who basically just took his idea and simplified it so that each cipher could fit on the tip of the finger. And it's, of course, what we come to know as Braille. It comes from night writing. And I really was interested in this connection, tactile and the visual. And my interest in blindness, which I've mentioned many times tonight, is less physical and more about the idea of not seeing. So if you could rephrase blindness to our degrees of blindness, though they're less specific to the physicality of the eye that I mentioned early on. So like the cloud glass, it's like something being revealed to you by seeing one who doesn't physically see but has another kind of vision. If you're sighted, you can't read it. If you read Braille, you can't touch it. Saying is really sort of revealing. It's hiding in plain sight, and it becomes this just ultimate. I'm not going to get into it. But because behind there's a mirror behind it, each of these little holes is like a tiny little mirror. So when you're walking in front of it, the whole surface appears to sort of navigating and a way of representing the setting of the Coast Guard, not with some kind of iconic, emblematic boat or anchor, but rather with something more universal and poetic. And I apologize for going a little over. I'm happy to take any questions. No questions? Which is fine too. Yes?
You said that the poetry of the night writing was epic. Can you give us a line of some of the words that we will never be able to see?
Well, I mean, it would sort of defeat the purpose because the idea is that it's not accessible and that you don't know. But if you read the titles, like that one that I showed that sort of looked like an arching Aurora Borealis, it's all based on the Aurora Borealis, the images, is called Hero and Leander. And so if you knew the story of Hero and Leander, you would be able to make connections between Leander crossing the Hellespont to get to the other side, and you would imagine what the story of that image would be just by the clues I've given you. The very long piece, and I'm only saying this because we're not in front of the work. I don't like to talk about the work in front of the work. But the very long piece that was night writing that I skipped over, there are three of them. One's called The Equator, one's called Tropic of Cancer, one's called Tropic of Capricorn. And the Braille basically goes through every city that cuts through each imaginary line. So in a nutshell, they're all sort of, what's in the Braille are names of people and places and things, and a lot of it actually is almost like a love letter, but it never gets revealed or named that or read as that. It's about being abstract. It's sort of better abstract. Any other questions? Yes, I'm sorry for the live webcast. I was supposed to repeat what you asked. So she asked about what the Braille said. Sorry. Yes?
I'm curious about the materials, and you were speaking earlier about your process. You have it in two parts. One is doing research, you're not quite sure what you're doing, and then you develop a why, and then you get into actually making the piece. And I'm wondering if you could describe where these materials are coming into that two-part process, because I'm looking at, from mirrors to graphite to silk. So would you become fascinated with the material along that research?
It almost, the question is what is the role of materials in my process, and what's the connection between making the leap from the conceptual part of figuring out why I'm making something and the more material part of how I respond to materials and why I choose materials and how I choose materials. So in my mind, it's not that separate. It's sort of fluid, it flows between one or the other. It's not that sort of linear. But I can tell you that I have never in my whole entire life had the kind of reaction where I see a material and I say, ooh, cool, I could use that. That's never happened to me. So it's usually just much more specific than that, where it actually has to be a very particular material in order for the idea to make sense. So the graphite pieces, I couldn't have made it with charcoal. It really was about graphite, and and graphite's different than charcoal, even if it doesn't look that different. The charcoal is a piece of wood that's burned, and the graphite is something that comes from underground. So I was making these connections between what was subterranean and the cosmos, and what's below and what's above. And so that's an example where it was actually very, very important that it be specific. And that sort of happens in every single piece, that specificity. When I get to that point, I struggle with finding materials that can transcend. I'm interested in making works that become almost sheer effect. So I have to find materials that can transcend their whatness, their solidity. And that can happen oftentimes it happens with really cheap materials. And it's more about what I do with them than about the material itself, like that floating installation, the pink one with the night writing that you walk under. That's just plastic tubes. Yes, there was one more question over here. Yes.
Explain a little bit more about your notion of landscape sculpture and how it's different from land art and sort of how, through your work with graphite, I think that's how you're kind of playing with this genre where the thing is being done.
I don't think the question is the question is about what my notion is of landscape sculpture, and how I define that sort of new genre. I don't think it's a new genre. I think it's always been there. I just think we don't really talk about it. So if you look at the history of sculpture is always kind of truncated. We have a lot about painting. We have very little about sculpture. So you go from, if you think of what's a landscape sculpture, there's sort of nothing there. You have land art, but land art is from the 1970s. So what happens before that? And you basically go from classical Greek sculptures with a stump of a trunk stuck to somebody's leg to hold them up as landscape sculpture to land art. And I find it really hard to believe that there's nothing in between. And it is because we have a kind of predilection for the painted image, especially in landscape, and that there are such strong traditions of the landscape being represented in painting. But what's different for me about land art, if you want to use that, and the idea of landscape sculpture, which is something that I'm trying to do, is that in one, you're projecting yourself into an image. It's not the real land. Just like when you look at a painting of a landscape. If you look at a Hudson School painters, look at one of those paintings of New England or the Hudson River. There's a whole sort of sublime thing happening there that is about projecting yourself into this image that's been idealized. It's about imagining, and it's about constructing and giving meaning to the image that you're looking at. Land art isn't about that. Land art is about physical stuff. It's about moving land. It's about marking the land. You engage in that projection, that sort of level of imagination in an entirely different way. So I think for me that's sort of, and I'm not trying to define it. These are all very subjective definitions that I have for myself, but that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to take something that's solid and big and hangs in a space and that's a block long and still have it be as close to a natural phenomenon as it can be. It's not that I'm trying to imitate nature. In fact, I'm not interested in doing that at all. I'm interested in putting something in front of you that makes you fabricate a sensibility that takes you to another place. It's about thinking and imagining more than it is about capturing an image or representing it or illustrating it.
Thank you, Teresita. I'd like to invite the audience for a reception upstairs in the G Street lobby, when if they'd like, they can talk to you a little bit more about your work. But thank you again for sharing.
Thank you so
your work
much.
with us.